Thank you for inviting me and for that nice introduction. And I'm very sorry that you're not going to be learning about how to decode consciousness today, because I cannot code in consciousness, but I can tell you about the social brain, and that's what I'm going to do. So firstly, I'm going to talk a bit about what I mean by the social brain, and I'm then going to talk about how social interaction appears to be critical in early development. I will talk about some recent research on how the social brain changes both in structure and function during the period of adolescence in humans. I will talk finally about how perspective taking continues to develop late in adolescence. And to wrap up, I will try to draw out some implications of this research for education. Okay, so what do I mean by the social brain? So I will show you an image that I think really nicely illustrates two aspects of how your social brain works. Okay, so what this image shows, some of you might recognize this photograph, is Michael Owen just having missed a goal for Liverpool. And the first aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates is how automatic and instinctive social emotional responses are. So within a split second of Michael Owen having missed this goal, everyone is doing the same thing with their faces and the same thing with their arms. Even Michael Owen, as he slides along the ground, is doing the same thing with his arms and presumably has a similar facial expression. And the only person who isn't is this guy up here. And he's making an equally recognizable social emotional response. The second aspect of the social brain that this picture nicely illustrates, and the aspect that my research is most focused on, is how good we are at reading other people's social emotional gestures and body language. So you don't have to ask any of these people how they're feeling. You have a very good idea just from observing their facial expressions and their bodily gestures, what is going on in their minds, how they're thinking, what they're thinking, and how they're feeling at this precise moment in time. Indeed, humans are exquisitely social. There's even evidence that we are born with some very basic social abilities, like, for example, the ability to detect faces. So there's a lot of evidence now that if you show newborn babies different stimuli, so faces or objects, and in this case, upright faces and inverted faces, so you can see that down at the bottom, so either upright cartoons of faces or upside down cartoons or real photographs of faces and upside down photos of faces, and you record how long newborn babies within a few hours of being born look at each stimulus, you find that they prefer, so they look longer at both cartoon faces and photographs of faces compared to upside down faces. They seem to prefer to look at real or cartoon face-like shapes. Similarly, very young babies will imitate facial expression. So this is old research by Andrew Meltzoff, who set his lab up in a maternity ward and recorded whether very, very young babies within a few days of being born will imitate facial expression. And as you can see here, babies tend to, after a while, imitate things like tongue protrusion and various other facial expressions. So we're born with some very basic social abilities, but of course social cognition becomes much more sophisticated over the first few months and years of life. And that's partly due to the massive amount of brain development that goes on in the first few weeks and months and years of life, depending on the brain region and the species of animal. So one of the brain developmental mechanisms that I'm going to focus on today is called synaptic reorganization. So here you have a diagram of a kind of typical brain cell. Your brain is made up of these cells amongst others, but these are the most common, called neurons. So you have the cell body and the axon along which electrical signals pass, and electrical signals are communicated via synapses or connections between one neuron and other neurons in the environment. So synapses become reorganized starting from very early on after conception in all brain regions. Initially, they undergo a period of synaptogenesis, that is the generation of new synapses. So the number of synapses massively multiplies in the first few weeks and months of life. So this is a diagram from the cortex of human post-mortem brain tissue, starting from a newborn baby going up to 6 months. And what you can see here is that the number of cells, the number of neurons, stays more or less stable. And it's really the number of connections. You can see these dendrites. They look like branches of trees massively multiplying in the first 6 months of life. And that goes on for many months or even years, depending on the brain area that we're talking about in the human brain. And it's followed by a period of synaptic pruning. Because this process of synaptogenesis results in an excess number of synapses. So young children, early in life, young animals, their brains contain more synapses, more connections than the adult brain. So you need this second process of synaptic pruning to eliminate excess synapses. So synaptogenesis is followed by synaptic pruning, and synaptic pruning, while it's genetically pre-programmed to a certain extent, it is also, to a certain extent, dependent on the environment that the animal is in. So we know that synapses that are used are strengthened, and synapses that are not used, because they're not needed in that particular environment the animal is in, are pruned away. And that effectively, that process of synaptic pruning away excess synapses that aren't useful for that particular environment, effectively fine-tunes brain tissue according to the species-specific environment. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example from the developmental psychology literature on learning language sounds in the first 9 months of life. So this area of developmental psychology is thought to depend on this process of synaptic pruning, although actually there's no direct evidence for that. But let me just give you the example. Okay, so we know, for example, that Japanese people find it impossible or very difficult to detect the difference between distinct R and L sounds. And that's simply because the Japanese language doesn't contain distinct R and L sounds. So Japanese babies aren't exposed to those distinct sounds in their first 9 months of life, and they lose the ability to distinguish between those sounds. So if you test Japanese babies being brought up in Japan before the age of 9 months, they can detect distinct R and L sounds just as well as any English speaker can. But because they're not exposed to those sounds in the Japanese language, the idea is that the synapses that would be used to process those distinct sounds are simply pruned away because they're not needed. They're wasting the brain's resources, so the brain may as well eliminate them. So one question is, can you relearn sounds after the first 9 months of life? And by the way, of course, this is not just Japanese babies. It's, there are many sounds in many different languages which, for example, English speakers are no longer able to detect over the first 9 months of life because we're simply not exposed to those distinct sounds in the English language. But can we relearn them? The answer is yes, and the experiment was done by Patricia Kuhl at the University of Washington in Chicago, who took groups of 9-month-old American babies who had never been exposed to Chinese Mandarin and therefore had lost the ability to distinguish between certain Mandarin sounds at 9 months. So she trained different groups of American babies to learn Mandarin. So the first group were exposed to a real native Chinese speaker, just a few minutes a day for about 5 weeks. In total, about 4 hours of exposure to a real-life native Chinese speaker, playing, reading, that kind of thing. The second group was exposed to exactly the same Chinese speaker and exactly the same content of Chinese Mandarin, but via a movie, so no real-life social interaction. And the third group were exposed to exactly the same content and duration of Chinese, but via a soundtrack, so just via headphones. And these are what the data looked like. So she recorded how well babies at 9 months can distinguish between two Mandarin sounds, which, by the way, to most of us sound absolutely identical, because unless you were exposed to Mandarin in the first 9 months of life, you won't be able to distinguish between those sounds. So native Chinese babies at 9 months are really good at distinguishing between those sounds, performing about 70% correct, whereas American babies who have never had any exposure to Chinese are very poor, performing around chance, around 50-50. Okay, so then we come to the data from the 3 training groups of babies. So the group of American babies who had been trained with a real-life Chinese speaker improved. They relearned those Mandarin sounds, and they were performing at around the same level as a native Chinese baby. So they, in fact, completely relearned the ability to distinguish between the sounds that they had previously lost. However, another interesting finding from this study was that being exposed to a video and being exposed to the sounds of the Mandarin language made no difference at all. There was no relearning in those 2 groups at all. So this study shows that firstly, relearning is possible after this 9-month kind of critical period is over. But it also shows that social interaction with a real live person seems to be a critical and constraining factor for this relearning. The question is why, and there are many different reasons why social interaction is so important. For example, it perhaps is more motivating, it's more interesting for babies to interact with a real life person than just to watch a DVD or whatever. And another possibility is that it's because when you're actually interacting with someone, both the teacher and the learner can kind of pick up on subconscious cues about what the other knows and doesn't know. So, for example, the teacher can pick up on what the child needs to know, what they don't know, and the learner, the baby, can pick up on what the teacher is intending by, for example, looking at an object or pointing at an object. And that ability to read other people's behavior in terms of underlying things like intentions and other mental states is what is called theory of mind. So theory of mind is defined as the attribution of mental states. So the ability to attribute things like intentions and beliefs to other people and also to oneself. And it's thought that an understanding of joint attention, so for example, following eye gaze, knowing that if I look at a certain object, then I'm interested in that object and I want to direct your attention to that object, and similarly with pointing to objects, develops really quite early on in life, so certainly within the first year of life. So probably babies are picking up on that kind of cue when they're doing real life social interaction. And there are many other steps of theory of mind development in the first 4 years of life, culminating, it's believed, in the ability to understand false beliefs. So false belief understanding is a bit like this. So if I hide my water bottle in this box over here, and I go out of the room, and then someone from the front comes, picks up the water bottle and hides it in a drawer here, when I come back into the room, you will know that I have a false belief about where my water bottle is. I believe the water bottle is still in the box where I left it, and that's where I'll go and search, when in reality, you know that the water bottle is in the drawer where the other person hid it. And that ability to understand that other people can have beliefs that are false and that differ from reality and differ from your own seems to develop at around 4 years of age, or at least the explicit understanding of that seems to develop at around age 4. So recently people have started to look at the neural basis of theory of mind. And for this they've used a whole wide range of stimuli. They've scanned people in brain scanners like MRI scanners, and I'll come back to MRI scans later, doing various different theory of mind tasks. And I'm just going to show you one. So if you look at the triangles, which I'm just about to start moving, you'll see that not only do you attribute mental states to other people, but also to two-dimensional shapes on a computer screen. Okay, so I heard from your reactions that you not only see these triangles as living like little creatures or little children, but also as having things like intentions, the big one wanting to coax the little one out of the box or whatever it is, and emotions, the little one being scared and then eventually both of them being happy. Now this is very odd because they are, after all, just triangles moving around on a computer screen. And it shows how, if you like, hardwired the tendency to attribute mental states and emotions is, that we even do it to two-dimensional shapes on a computer screen just because of the way their particular movement patterns appear and the way they appear to be interacting with each other. So if you put people in a brain scanner and you look at the patterns of brain activity that occur when you're watching this kind of animation compared to an animation that involved the same triangles but just moving around randomly, you find activity in what's known as the social brain. So the social brain is defined as the network of brain regions involved in understanding other people, involved in attributing mental states and emotions to other people. And the social brain includes these areas here. So we have dorsal, medial, prefrontal cortex right at the front of the brain in the midline, and then two regions both sides of the brain, the posterior superior temporal sulcus, or the PSTS, as I'm going to be calling it, at the side just behind the ears, and the temporal poles on both sides, slightly lower down in the temporal cortex. Now, the interesting thing about these regions is that it doesn't matter how you get people to attribute mental states in the scanner. whether it's by reading them long stories where they have to think about the story characters' mental states, showing them animations like the one I just showed you, or cartoons, or just sentences. These areas are consistently activated in many, many studies. There are probably about 60 studies, imaging studies, looking at the neural basis of theory of mind, and they all show this very consistent, reliable result. So the question then, and the question that we're interested in my lab, is how does the social brain develop, and particularly during the period of adolescence? So I'm now going to kind of shift gears a bit and tell you about the development of the social brain and what is known about it. Firstly, from a kind of histological cellular point of view, the answer is not much. Not much is known about how the human brain develops in terms of things like synapses. So you remember I told you about synaptic reorganization that goes on very early on in development. Well, we know from a very small number of papers published in the 70s and 80s by Peter Huttenlocher at the University of Chicago that this kind of synaptic reorganization goes on for much, much longer. It has a much more protracted period of development in the human brain. So Huttenlocher studied post-mortem human brain tissue, and he counted the number of synapses. So if you remember, these are the kind of synapses that he'd be counting, in different slices of brain tissue from different brain regions of brains of different ages. So this is post-mortem human brain tissue. And what he found, if you look at the dotted line, is that in the visual cortex, so that's the part of the brain at the back that processes the visual world, synaptic density initially increases, so that's synaptogenesis, the generation of new synapses, until about mid-childhood, and then decreases again through the process of synaptic pruning until around age 10, after which it doesn't really change very much. And in the frontal cortex, you have a much more protracted period of synaptic development where you get this kind of waxing and waning of synaptic density throughout childhood. And synaptic density in the frontal cortex doesn't peak until around 11 or 12. In other words, around the age of puberty onset. And then it decreases during adolescence and into the 20s. And so what the sort of take-home message from this research was that at least the frontal cortex of the human brain undergoes very protracted development, and particularly undergoes a kind of change in terms of synaptic density at around puberty, with a large amount of synaptic pruning going on in adolescence and into the 20s. So that was how the textbooks were written for many years after this research was carried out, and there was very, very little else that was known about the development of the human brain until about 10 years ago, when people started to use MRI scanners to look at how the living human brain develops. So this is an MRI scanner. Some of you may have had MRI scans. You lie in the bore of the scanner here, and it acquires images of your brain. And the images of the brain that it acquires look a bit like this. These are the kind of structural images you get. Very detailed, high-resolution, three-dimensional images of the living human brain. And there are various different aspects of the brain you can look at and measure, and particularly in development, and one of them is grey matter. So grey matter, you can see here, is the folded parts of the cortex, the surface of the brain, around the edge. And white matter, by the way, is what appears white here, and corresponds to those long fibers or axons of neurons along which electrical impulses travel. And those axons are covered in a substance called myelin, which appears white on the MRI scanner. Grey matter is around the edge and contains the rest of the neurons, so for example, cell bodies and synapses and other neuropil. Okay, so how does, for example, grey matter develop in the living human brain? We now know quite a lot about that, in particular from research done by Jay Geed and his colleagues at NIH in the USA. So this is data from one of the very first developmental imaging studies ever published by Jay Geed and his colleagues in 1999, showing the development of grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex, in boys in blue and in girls in red. So what you can see is that between the age of 4 and 22 years, grey matter volume initially increases during childhood. The peak of grey matter volume occurs, which is shown, by the way, by these arrows here, occurs a couple of years later in boys than in girls, and that more or less corresponds to the, on average, 2-year delay in puberty onset in boys relative to girls, and then decreases again during adolescence. And we don't really know in terms of cellular changes what these changes in grey matter volume correspond to, but one theory is that these changes in grey matter volume, because they look so similar to the changes in synaptic density that Huttenlocher found, is that the changes in grey matter volume reflect synaptogenesis during childhood and synaptic pruning during adolescence. And what about medial prefrontal cortex? So medial prefrontal cortex is one of the regions that I showed you a few slides ago, which seems to be a critical component of the human social brain. So we know that medial prefrontal cortex is involved, for example, in theory of mind, in the attribution of mental states, and in many other processes that are relevant to understanding other people. Well, a recent study from the Geed lab at NIH showed that medial prefrontal cortex is one of the brain regions that is latest developing in humans. So what this shows is the medial prefrontal cortex viewed from below, and it's the developmental trajectory in terms of cortical thickness, which is very similar to grey matter volume, so the thickness of the cortex, between the ages of 5 and about 30, in medial prefrontal cortex. So what you can see is that some areas of medial prefrontal cortex, shown in blue, undergo a linear decrease in cortical thickness. They just lose cortical thickness or decrease in cortical thickness with age, whereas other regions of medial prefrontal cortex, shown in red and green, undergo this non-linear developmental trajectory, either cubic or quadratic. So they increase and then decrease in cortical thickness, a bit like grey matter volume, not surprisingly. Now, one interesting finding from these data is that the areas that undergo these non-linear trajectories tend to be the phylogenetically newer regions of the cortex, whereas the regions that undergo this linear decrease tend to be phylogenetically older, so older in evolutionary terms. And the other interesting finding from this study was that if you calculate the age at which cortical thickness peaks in medial prefrontal cortex, you find that it's one of the latest developing regions of the brain. It peaks at around age 14 years, after which time cortical thickness decreases. So really a very late developing brain region. And that's, by the way, similar for the regions of the temporal cortex that we also know are involved in the social brain. Both medial prefrontal cortex and, for example, posterior superior temporal sulcus, or PSTS, are very late developing regions in the human brain. So this leaves us with an interesting paradox. We know that typically developing children pass theory of mind tasks by age 4. It's very difficult to construct a theory of mind task that, for example, involves false belief, understanding, or whatever, that a child of age 4 or 5 can't pass. And if they can't pass it, then it's really quite likely that an adult can't pass it either. So something kind of switches on in terms of theory of mind development at around age 4. And yet we know that parts of the social brain that are critically involved in theory of mind and social cognition continue to develop in terms of grey matter, at least, well after early childhood, right throughout adolescence. And yet, until very recently, there was just nothing known about the consequences in terms of, for example, brain function and behavior of this structural brain development, particularly of the social brain. And so my research has recently been focusing on the period of adolescence. Adolescence, as we know anecdotally, and there are decades of social psychology research looking at adolescence as a time of social transition. We know that if you think, go back, remember what it was like being a teenager, or think about teenagers that you know or work with, that it is a time of change, in particular with respect to things like self-awareness, self-consciousness, but also interaction with other people, peer influence, risk-taking, things like that. I mean, stereotypically, not all adolescents, but certainly there's something going on in terms of changing processes involved in social cognition and interaction with other people. So for the rest of the talk, I'm going to tell you about a few studies that we've done looking at how brain activity during social cognition tasks changes between adolescence and adulthood, and also some work that we've recently done looking at how social behavior changes during adolescence. Okay, so firstly, a couple of studies that we did fairly recently looking at brain activity during different social cognition paradigms. So the first study looked at the development of intentions understanding during adolescence. So here we scanned using fMRI. So fMRI, like I mentioned previously, is the same scanner, the MRI scanner, but it allows you to acquire data about how the brain is active during certain tasks. It basically lets you look at where blood is flowing to in the brain during a certain task compared to another task, and that gives you an indication of where neurons are active. So we scanned a group of adolescents and a group of adults while they were thinking about intentions. So we had an intentional causality condition where participants read a long series of scenarios pertaining to their intentions. So, for example, you want to find out what's on at the cinema. Do you look in a newspaper? Is that likely or unlikely? So we're just getting people to think about having an intention like this one and what kind of consequential action they might take as a result of that intention. We compare activity in this condition to an activity in a condition where, again, we're asking about cause and effect, but here the cause and effect is purely physical and natural. So, for example, it's been raining very heavily for a few days. Does the ground warm up? And the comparison, we know from previous studies, the comparison between these two conditions results in activity of the social brain network. And that's exactly what we found here. So when we compared intentional, compared with physical causality conditions, both in adults and adolescents, we found activity in the social brain network. So what this shows is activation patterns in adults and in adolescents, which, first of all, you should spot are very similar. And the second thing you should spot is that it's the classic social brain network activating. So medial prefrontal cortex in both, the PSTS in both, on both sides. So this is the same, the bottom two images are exactly the same patterns of activity, but just shown from above. And the temporal poles, the other area of the social brain network. And also the precuneus, which again is often activated as part of the social brain network, but I'm not going to mention that again. Okay, so the adults and adolescents' overall patterns of activity look very similar. That's not surprising. Even though adolescents' brains are developing, it's not like they don't have a frontal cortex or something like that. You would not expect to see dramatically different patterns of activity. However, when we then went and compared directly activations in the adults and adolescents, we found one significant difference, and that is in medial prefrontal cortex. So although medial prefrontal cortex is active both in adolescents and adults, we found that it was more active in adolescents than adults for the intentional condition compared with the physical condition, and its activity significantly decreased with age. So this shows activity in this region plotted against age in years from 8 to 38. And we found exactly the same pattern of results in a second study that we did, this time looking at the processing of social emotions during adolescence. So again, we scanned a group of adolescents and a group of adults, this time while they're thinking about social emotions. And here we're defining social emotions as emotions that require the representation of someone else's mental state. So for example, guilt and embarrassment. To feel guilty or to feel embarrassed, you need to think about how someone else would feel or how someone else would think about you as a consequence of your action. The other reason we were interested in embarrassment is because if you think about it, embarrassment is an interesting emotion to look at in adolescence. So I remember an anecdote from one of my colleagues a few years ago. He said that he had teenage daughters at the time. He said the thing that was most striking about the development pre and post puberty in his daughters was their perception of embarrassment. So he said that, you know, if before puberty, if they were messing around in a supermarket, he would say, stop messing around, I'll sing you your favourite song. And they would instantly stop messing around and he'd sing their favourite song in the middle of the supermarket. And after puberty, that became the threat. Something changes about embarrassment during puberty. And not very much is known about why or how. But it's not that children can't be embarrassed, but something changes in, for example, what triggers embarrassment and also the intensity of embarrassment during adolescence. So we compared social emotions, well, there are a few examples here from the guilt condition, to the neural processing of basic emotions like disgust and fear, which don't require the representation of someone else's mental states to be understood or felt. So subjects lay in the scanner and just read many scenarios that were designed to evoke low-level feelings of certain emotions, these 4 different emotions. Again, when we compared activity between social emotions and basic emotions, we found activity in the social brain network for both groups. However, when we directly compared the 2 groups, adolescents and adults, we found exactly the same thing as in our previous study, that activity in dorsal medial prefrontal cortex, while it was active in both groups, its activity was much higher in adolescents than in adults, and its activity decreased with age. And in fact, I did a meta-analysis a couple of years ago on all the studies that had ever been done, all the fMRI studies that had ever been done, there are only 6 so far, this is a very, very new field, on brain activity during social cognition tasks, so during theory of mind tasks, between adolescence and adulthood. And all 6 studies, believe it or not, showed exactly the same thing. This is very remarkable for imaging, where you get a lot of inconsistent results, but this was a very consistent result by these 6 studies, all carried out around the same time by different labs using very different stimuli and different tasks, but all the tasks and stimuli had some kind of theory of mind component, so some social cognition component, and you can see them here. So this is the region of medial prefrontal cortex whose activity, or in which activity, decreases between adolescence and adulthood during social cognition tasks. So there seems to be something very real going on there. The question is why, and the answer is we have no idea yet. This is a very new field. It's only really 3 or 4 years old, and people are only just starting to think about why adolescents activate medial prefrontal cortex more than adults. One possibility is that they're using different cognitive strategies to do these tasks. So maybe, for example, adolescents have to conjure up specific instances of these things happening to them, whereas adults can answer these questions or think about these scenarios in a more automatic way. That's one possibility we're looking into at the moment, but we don't have any data on yet because we've only just started. The second possibility is that the functional changes in this area of the brain are a result of the structural changes. So we know that between early adolescence and adulthood, you lose grey matter and synaptic pruning is going on. And perhaps that means that you generate, or the prefrontal cortex generates more activity as measured by fMRI in early adolescence and adulthood. But that is a theory that actually is pretty much untestable in the human brain because we just have no technique to look at, for example, synapses in the living human brain. Finally, my final couple of slides. What are the behavioral consequences of social brain development? So we know that the brain develops both structurally in terms of grey matter and white matter. I haven't even talked about that, but it does, during adolescence, and functionally. So the medial prefrontal cortex and actually other areas of the brain change in terms of activity during adolescence. Surely this must have some consequence for adolescent behaviour. And yet again, until very recently, there were just no studies on that. The studies showed, all the studies that had been done on, for example, theory of mind, showed that, well, by age 4, children pass theory of mind tasks, and then nothing really much happens to theory of mind. But this just doesn't make sense in terms of what we know about the brain basis of theory of mind and how that is changing really relatively late in development. And one possibility for this complete lack of literature on this subject is the fact that the theory of mind tasks that we have are not very ecologically valid. They don't really resemble social cognition in everyday life. You come into the lab, you just focus on, one particular task where you're having to answer questions about someone's mental states, which is very different from the way we use theory of mind in everyday life, where you use it in the very speeded in the context of communication and other stuff going on like decision making and emotions and all sorts of things. So we decided to use a task that that really focuses on theory of mind usage and the ability to use theory of mind information or perspective-taking information to make decisions. And we decided to look at that and how that performance on that task develops during adolescence. So this is the task. Okay, so imagine that you're the participants. You see this set of shelves with different objects on different shelves. And this man here, he's the director. And in this task, he's going to tell you, you're kind of having a conversation with him, although it's a little bit one-sided, but still. He's going to be telling you to move objects around. So he's going to be telling you to move objects up and down, left or right. your left or right, by the way, not his. And notice that some of the objects on the shelves are occluded from his point of view. He can't see them because there's a piece of wood behind them. And this is what the shelves look like from his point of view. So he can't see some of the objects. And by the way, he's never going to be telling you to move an object that he can't see. So there are many trials, and on each trial there's a different set of shelves with different objects on. And in the crucial condition, you might be asked by the director, move the top truck right. You're right, remember. That's not relevant. So which truck would you move? Blue. You're all good. If you did this task in either the real-life version of this task, which was designed by a guy called Kaiser and colleagues, or our computerized version, what we found is that intelligent, normal, healthy adults make errors on this condition about 50% of the time. So 50% of the time, more or less, normal, intelligent adults will move this red lorry, even though the red truck, even though the red truck is a kind of conflict object, because even though it's the top truck from your perspective, it's not the top truck from the director's perspective. And as you said, the top truck from his perspective is the blue one. So it's the blue one you're supposed to move. There are control conditions where there's no third truck. And we also designed a control condition where we gave you a simple rule to adhere to. So rather than having to take anyone's perspective in this condition, notice the director's gone, you'll still be asked to move things around, but this time we tell you at the beginning of the session, okay, now ignore objects with a grey background. If an object has a grey background, we're not talking about that object. So it's exactly the same, effectively. It's exactly the same task. Move the top truck right. Well, this top truck has a grey background, so you don't mean that. It must be this blue one here. It's effectively exactly the same thing, but in this condition, in order to move the correct truck, you don't need to take into account someone else's perspective. So in our experiment, we tested a large number of in this particular experiment, girls, but we've also replicated the effect with a large number of boys, between the ages of about 7 and 27 years, divided into 5 groups, as you can see here. This is the age range of the different groups. The groups did not differ on IQ. They were matched in terms of IQ. Notice the high IQ, so 120 is very high. And these are the data. So let me just explain what these are. This is the percentage errors made in the light blue, in the director task, where there's a conflict between your perspective and his perspective. And you can see that our highly intelligent adults are making errors almost 50% of the time in this task, whereas when you give them the rule, this light green here, they are much better, only making errors on about 10% of trials. And what you can see developmentally is that both the director condition and the rule condition improve in performance between childhood and adolescence, but it's the difference between these two last groups which is really interesting. So here you get no change in performance between mid-adolescence and adulthood on the rule condition, but you get a significant improvement on the perspective-taking condition between mid-adolescence and adulthood. So what that suggests is that the ability to take into account someone else's perspective to direct appropriate behavior, so in other words, to use theory of mind in a kind of more ecologically valid communicative task, is still developing, is still improving during mid and late adolescence. Couple more slides. Okay, finally, people have started to look at how social interaction affects things like decision-making on a risk-taking task. So this is a study where subjects played a driving game, and the number of risks or crashes people took were measured, and adolescents, young adults, and adults were tested either alone, and you can see their data here. So the number of risks they take or the number of crashes they make are very similar in these 3 groups. And in a second condition, the participants had a couple of their friends standing behind them. When they had a couple of friends standing behind them, this dramatically increased the number of risks taken in the adolescent group, but not in the 2 adult groups. So in other words, what this suggests is that adults and adolescents take around the same number of risks on their own, but it's just when they have a couple of friends with them that massively increases the number of risks adolescents take, but it doesn't change the number of risks adults take. So that has obvious implications for driving. My final slide Implications for education. We know that the social brain is developing during adolescence. We assume there might be influences of the environment on brain development during adolescence, but we have no idea yet what they are. This research suggests that teaching is important and worthwhile, crucial during adolescence, and yet the idea that adolescents should go to school is a very new and recent idea, and in some countries most adolescents still don't go to school and don't receive education. And finally, should the curriculum include metacognition classes? So at the moment the secondary school curriculum focuses on academic subjects, but perhaps subjects where we know that the parts of the brain that underlie those processes, like risk-taking, peer influence, empathy, self-awareness, and these kinds of things, we know that they're developing during adolescence. Perhaps we shouldn't assume that adolescents can do these things just as well as adults can. Finally, I would like to thank my group and my collaborators. Thank you.